Hello everybody, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. My name is Dominic McHugh, and I've been working in IT asset management and specifically Microsoft licensing for around 15 years. And today I'm going to talk about risk, and specifically those associated with Microsoft. So what are the categories of risks we see, the causes of these risks, a little bit of a deep dive into some of the specific and most common risks that we see, and then also a section around prevention and management of those risk areas. So firstly, what are the three risk categories that we define? And I think firstly, the reason we split these down into these different categories are as to where these can be managed around the business. And typically they may be different departments or personnel who can take ownership for managing some of these areas of risk. And the first of those is clearly financial risk. So where current or budgeted spend will change at the next anniversary or renewal. The second being licensing risk, so traditional license compliance discoverable through audit processes and tools that we may have in place. And then thirdly, technical risk, so the deployment of products or features that might have either a technical or a cost implication, creating a risk out the back of those. Now, the one thing that all these have in common is clearly it could mean money out the door, and again, that word of unbudgeted spend, which will loom large for many. So what are the main causes of risk with regards to Microsoft and licensing in particular? I think the first of those, as anybody who's ever dealt with Microsoft licensing, will be complexity. And again, the reason that many of us are dedicated to looking at Microsoft licensing as our day job, because it's notoriously complicated to navigate. There are continuously evolving product terms, product names, suites of products, differences throughout the course of time in how these products have been licensed. Processes. This is more of an internal feature where perhaps internal communication between various functions or personnel over time has resulted in different views of how an estate is licensed or what entitlement we have in place, and also perhaps an approval process for deploying new technology, which could create potentially licensing or technical risk. Business need. Quite often we see the increase in certainly financial expenditure because of new initiatives require more technology, new configurations, or even cost-saving initiatives that are trying to drive change and potentially causing risk in other areas because of items that you're not able to deploy or that you're changing because of the need to drive change. And then finally, there are many external factors as well as internal factors around business growth and budgeting processes. So by external factors, we're looking at vendor pricing, product changes during a contract term that will inevitably all come together at the end of the contract once it's being renewed. So the first of these specific areas is technical risk. And I think when we look at technical risk, we're talking about things that members of the organization may look at deploying new technology, or there may be a business process or business change that has an underlying need for new technology, something that typically those who are deploying and configuring IT systems or products or features will have over responsibility for looking at. And the first of these areas is with regards to Azure. So the biggest risk with regards to Azure spend is that actually we've got a lot of wastage in the environment, whether that be zombie resources, idle services that aren't being used. Maybe we've lifted and shifted our environment into Azure. We need to right size our virtual machines. The maturity of our environment versus the reservation approach that we use, making sure that we're as lean as possible in terms of reservations and savings plans and pay as you go type subscriptions. We need to make sure that we're continually monitoring those to make sure that one of the emerging risks over certainly the last year to 18 months has been in the broader Power Platform area, and certainly the creation of apps and flows to meet increasing business demand for agility around these areas and the potential premium licensing requirements that these bring. Certainly there is an increasing amount of complexity now with regards to flows and process mining, AI builders. This will naturally be embedded into business processes, and therefore it makes it very difficult to unpick at a later point in time. And this is one of the largest causes of technical debt that we see within organizations today. Next, storage. So the increasing utilization of apps and AI, seeing a storage proliferation across the environment. Indeed, we're working with an organization at the moment who is a storage autoscaler, and the savings in this area can be immense if looked at in the right way. AI and Copilot. As I mentioned, with Power Platform being emerging over the last year to 18 months, I think it's pretty clear to everybody that over the next year to 18 months, the use of AI, specifically the various Copilots available from Microsoft, will bring risk to the organization just because of the varied technologies and the prerequisites that are in place for these. And for many organizations, there will be no blueprint. So what policies do we need to adhere to from a legal or a compliance perspective? What do we need to do and set up, and how do we need to structure the organization's data before we start using these technologies? There's an abundance of questions there that need to be answered before we can deploy a lot of these items with peace of mind. And then finally, around security and compliance. So many Microsoft tools can be switched on at a tenant level, and actually what we don't know is, firstly, whether we're licensed to do that, or secondly, do we need to enable a certain feature for everybody? Is it just certain groups of users that need to look at that? And that will lead us on into the licensing risk in a second. But the biggest thing that we see with technical risk is balancing the need of the organization. So having secure platforms, that business agility, with the budget, the costs that we have to try and control and maintain. So when we look at licensing risk in particular, this is typically where we associate risk and compliance with regards to Microsoft over the course of time. I mentioned previously around the configuration of tenant-based services, predominantly in the security and compliance space, but actually knowing which features and policies we're enabled for, because actually there may be parts of the organizations that we aren't licensed to switch these on for. And actually, once we've enabled these features, going back and unpicking or taking that off users or mailboxes at a later point in time might be very tricky to do. Azure Hybrid Benefit is one that is also a major risk, largely because it's self-policing. There's no automated way or tool that Microsoft gives to tell you exactly what licensing you have to use for Hybrid Benefit, or whether indeed you're compliant with that. So you do either need to track that internally or seek the advice of experts or FinOps practitioners to make sure that you are fully covered for your deployment of Hybrid Benefit. SQL Server is perennially the most frequent offender in Microsoft audits, certainly going back over the last 15 years since I've been working in this sector. And those of you who have ever dealt with SQL licensing will appreciate how complex it has been over the course of time. And that is always one that should have a very close eye kept on it, just because of the costs of any associated risk there as well. Desktop provision. So RDS and Citrix environments also used to be common offenders alongside SQL Server. Over the course of time, Microsoft have made the licensing rules slightly easier to follow and a little bit more leeway with regards to what you can do with regards to remote working practices and environments. But we also need to make sure that any personas within our estate are adequately licensed. And this can go down to looking at things like device sizes for users who maybe have certain subscriptions assigned. Managing Office 365 subscriptions, or indeed any online service, is one that can present risk. So looking at our inactive and accounts and any users who may have duplicate licensing assigned, these are quick wins. Now, although this may not represent a compliance risk, actually it's a financial risk to the organization, because we could have potentially spare licenses sitting there that we can use rather than going buying brand new ones. And indeed, post a contract renewal, many of you in the past will have seen that your license allocation actually doubles in your portal for a short period of time, whilst the old licenses sit there within a grace period. And that could present a risk for anybody who is managing that environment and doesn't necessarily understand the nuances of that. And then finally, with regards to licensing risk, general use rights. Now, Microsoft have made the product terms much easier to navigate now. Indeed, it's an online web version now, whereas it used to be a Word document many years ago. And you can compare use rights from across various time periods. So it could be now, it could be 2 years ago, it could be 3 years ago. However, communicating general use rights maybe to newer members of the organization or those who aren't as familiar with Microsoft licensing is important to be able to do, so that they can understand the terms, and making sure that every time a new product is bought or renewed, there is still compliance within those terms. And all of these items just form one sort of big mix of potential risk that ultimately, as an organization and end user, it can be very confusing in trying to navigate all of those. So let's look at financial risk. Obviously, all of the previous areas that we mentioned will contribute towards financial risk, but aside of compliance and potential technical risk, what will pose a financial risk to the organization? Well, the first of those is we see product changes. So Microsoft changing a particular product, maybe changing the addition of how something is licensed, maybe turning it from a suite into individual applications, such as with Dynamics back in 2019. That can have a significant effect. Product price increases, again, something largely outside of our control. But if we look at March 2022, that was the first major Office 365 price increase globally, I believe, since the product was first introduced back in its early days of BPOS, or business productivity, as it's referred to back then. Equally, alongside that, we now have biannual currency harmonizations with the US dollar. So many of you will have felt the effect earlier on this year of some changes that were made at that first harmonization. Many of you may not have seen that yet, and actually that's still to come at your next contract renewal, potentially along with the March 2022 increases as well. So again, a compound effect there. Contractual requirements can represent a risk as well. So quite often, those of you who maybe seeked aggressive discounts at the point of renewal might have license minimums within your agreement that you can't go below, or there could be spend commitments such as with Azure services, and therefore they represent a potential risk if the business changes and potentially needs to downsize. Scope creep, so business growth, new product requirements. This is often something where we see an increased stress on budgets occurring at the point of renewal, and I will touch on that a little bit in a couple of slides' time further. And then finally, your pricing security and flexibility. So some program offerings will offer us potentially better pricing and potentially better flexibility, but with that comes a potentially inherent risk of less pricing security, so perhaps for a shorter period of time, and that's something that needs to be managed. And all of these items need to be weighed across the course of a contract term, because what we quite often find happening is that the actual spend incurred will outweigh the budget that's been put in. So when we take all of those items into account, what we often see at the point of renewal is the compounded effect of all of these risks. So a realization of a lot of these at the same point in time. So business growth, vendor price changes, new commercial structures. It might be that you're addressing some license compliance issues towards the end of your contract. It might be that there's new technologies that are about to be purchased. So what we often see, and hopefully this gives you a good visual, is that your agreement may have started out at, for example, £2 million per annum spend when you signed it 3 or maybe 5 years ago, but you might have grown during that time, and the growth of maybe whether it be users or some new technology that you've added during that period has added another, say, 450k to the environment. It may be that when we take account of the price changes that have happened to various products and the price harmonizations, that could add another a weight there. It could be that we've got some compliance issues that we need to address, so that adds another layer on top of the requirements. And then it could be as well that we are buying new technology. So perhaps we've got a proof of concept running for something, or we know that we're going to start deploying a new technology very soon into our next agreement. So we will buy it at the point of renewal in order to seek a more aggressive discount. And what you can see there is that very quickly, through all of these items having a compound effect, we'll quickly see a baseline as such go from 2 million to 3 million pounds, and then we need to try and find rationalizations from there. So hopefully that gives a good indication as to when you come to looking at the contract renewal, the types of things to be budgeting for and expecting. So then how can we look to either prevent or manage those risks? There are clearly some of these risks that are outside of our control. So if we take vendor price changes, as an example, that is clearly something we have no control over. We can manage the expectations of the organisation throughout the course of a contract as to what is coming up in the future. However, we cannot completely overcome them. However, for some of the items that we've discussed, we potentially can prevent. So how would we do this? This follows a pretty typical sort of ITAM, process and policy and best practice procedure. The first of those is people. So making sure that there's a contract owner from Microsoft. It could be multiple contract owners depending on the scale and breadth of the organization. Having a virtual Microsoft team who at all times are communicating strategy, they're communicating costs, knowing what the impact is further down the line of, if I deploy this, do I then need to go and buy something else? Do I need to make sure that I've already got the licensing for this in place? Is there going to be a knock-on impact further down the line? So a good example for that could be we're looking at adopting Microsoft 365 Copilot. Okay, great. We've done all the necessary due diligence around getting our data into the right spaces. Oh, but actually we don't have the licensing prerequisite to do that. So that could be a good example of where we hadn't predicted or we weren't aware that there could be some more spend that's there. Having regular knowledge sharing sessions between technical and commercial teams is important so that everybody understands the totality of the risk and the potential commercial impact. Equally, what will underpin a lot of those as well is processes. So having a regular cadence of compliance focused activities. So making sure that there is at very least an annual compliance review, or that it is incorporated into the change process that includes that contract owner or owners. Having a cost impact analysis that is built into strategy decisions or planning exercises when looking at new technology, so that every potential cost is understood, and keeping the right people central to this process throughout. And then finally, documentation. So the best way to keep account of these is to maintain and communicate risk register items at all times, whether that be compliance risk, whether that be a future risk of we're currently evaluating this technology, it's going to cost us X when we come to look at buying it. Is that feasible within our budgets? Keeping contract information, entitlement and use rights up to date. If there is a change for the better, then great, let's communicate. Might not represent a risk now, but represents a risk potentially at the end of the contract. Let's look at calling that out now. Are there any mitigating factors or measures that we can implement now to make sure that that risk is reduced somewhat towards the end of the contract? So hopefully that's given you a good steer as to the main risks that we see. Obviously, our job at Bytes is to help you as customers manage that risk, reduce the risk, and mitigate that risk wherever possible. There are obviously a number of services that Bytes offer that can help supporting in these areas. Compliance management being a typical service, certainly around understanding the compliance risk and managing that throughout the course of your contract term and having that as an ongoing process. Our commercial advisory service, which assists organisations in making sure they've done the due diligence ahead of contract renewal, so making sure all of those changes are understood. Have you undertaken all of the optimization measures that you can to make sure your contract is as lean and commercially beneficial as possible? And our cost optimization services as well, which focus around cloud spend and making sure that is as lean as possible at all times, specifically with regards to Azure and Office 365. And you'll see there is a link to our cost optimization guide, which will also be posted within the comments section where the video is posted. If you would like any further information, if you are an existing customer, please do contact your account manager for further information. If you're new to Bytes, there's a mail address there to message. Please do feel free to look myself up on LinkedIn as well, or message back to any of the Bytes personnel copied in on the video link if you would like more information. And finally, for me, thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been informative and gives you something to think about, and hopefully speak to many of you in the future. Thank you very much.